Prince is the Leonardo Professor in the School of Engineering at Stanford University, Professor of Material Science and Engineering. I'll warn you, this is a long intro because apparently you do lots of things. Professor of Material Science and Engineering, Professor of Mechanical Engineering, and Senior Fellow at the Precourt Institute for Energy. He also serves as the Director of the Quantum Mechanical Engineering Laboratory and Faculty Co-Director of the NPL Affiliate Program. A solid-state physicist by training, Prince leads a group of doctoral students, postdoctoral scholars, and visiting scholars who are addressing fundamental issues on energy conversion and storage at the nanoscale. So I will kick it off to you to do our introduction. Thank you.
It's an honor and a privilege to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Tim Holm, Chief Technology Officer at QuantumScape Corporation. And the reason why it's a great pleasure and honor for me is because Tim Holm did his PhD in my group at Stanford. Just to be a bit more specific, Tim finished his bachelor's in physics at Stanford, and he has some interesting stories to tell about some of the courses, which I won't go into details. And then he did an internship in mechanical engineering and shortly joining my group in 2005. So we're just celebrating 20 years. I just also looked at some papers, and there's also pleased to see Professor Pronprasatsuk here, Professor Rojana Pronprasatsuk. She has a joint paper, the three of us, which was published, I think, 15 years ago in 2010. So it's actually a long history which we had together. And what's exciting is that Tim has led QuantumScape in a very, very exciting direction, where they have now achieved clearly world record performance, which has a potential of really changing the entire industry and changing the field of energy storage. So those changes don't come overnight, but if you focus on progress, you can ultimately succeed, and Tim is virtually reached that point. And that's why, for me as his former advisor, I'm so excited and so proud to present Tim Holm to you today. So with that brief introduction, thank you very much for joining us. It's an honor and a pleasure. I do want to point out, when you look at Tim, not only is he a great scientist and intellectual, pleasure to work with, he's also very good he's an athlete as well. I was always impressed that Tim has been competing in triathlons, which I cannot even imagine what it is to compete in that domain. But he was quite successful, and I have also admired you, not only for that, but primarily for your scientific contributions.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Great. Well, thanks. It's really fun to be back on campus again. I'm wearing the Stanford colors, so it's fun to be here. And this talk will cover kind of two parts. The first half will be a much broader introduction to batteries. My thought is that at the Stanford Energy Seminar, probably a lot of folks want a little bit of a connection between how our battery relates to the bigger picture in energy. And then the second part of the talk is going to be a really much more narrow but deep dive into one small area of importance to us. But this should hopefully give some depth to those of you who are really curious and want to learn more. We are a public company, so I have to say something about making forward-looking statements. You can see our risk disclosures on the SEC website. All right. Let's get into some fun. So batteries are not inherently safe devices. They are inherently energy storage devices, which means they can release that energy in some exciting ways and some scary ways. So engineering is very important in terms of making these batteries safer. What you'll see right here is a standard automotive test that is used to qualify batteries before they're allowed to go into vehicles. What happens is you put a battery inside a thermal chamber and heat it up in various stages until about 200 degrees C. And at that point, basically all lithium-ion batteries will have failed by the time they reach 200 degrees C. So that's where the official test ends. We modified this test to go up to 300 degrees C. You might say, well, if the battery is not ever going to get that hot, what is this test important for? Well, some cars are going to get in accidents. When the cars get in accidents, sometimes the battery pack gets impinged upon. Sometimes those batteries fail. They can fail in energetic ways, meaning they get hot. And what the car designer wants to do is prevent that hot zone from basically propagating in kind of a chain reaction. A battery gets hot, that makes the next battery get hot and catch on fire, which makes the next battery get hot. So you want to contain that. So this test is basically a test of what's called thermal propagation resistance. And what you're seeing are two different batteries, one lithium-ion battery on the left and our battery on the right. So I've started the video. This chamber is getting hot. We're now at about 60 degrees, then ramping up. You can see discoloration of some of the paper that's there as a label. We're now at 120 degrees and starting to ramp up. Here we are at about 160 degrees or so, and the commercial lithium-ion battery that is in vehicles today will do something like that. Pretty much all lithium-ion batteries will do something like that, like I said, before 200 degrees. So what you want to do is increase the temperature of resistance and then design an automotive pack that creates a relatively safe environment. But you can see here as the smoke clears, our battery at 200 degrees is still thriving, at least surviving. Now we're going to ramp up to 300 degrees. You'll see it actually opens up because there are some polymer seals where the polymers fail by 300 degrees, but the battery has not gone into an energetic or thermal runaway, no massive energy release. So this is a relatively unprecedented test result for an energy-dense battery. You can see it's even open to the air and still nothing bad happening to it. So that's exciting. I'll start off with one other safety test here that compares our batteries versus a lithium-ion battery. This is not a standard test, but this is one that our internal environmental health and safety group wanted us to run because we're handling thousands of batteries in our lab. A gigafactory would be handling billions of batteries. So basically a lot of things could happen in a manufacturing environment. So we wanted to say, what are some worst case scenarios? All right, what if a screwdriver gets dropped onto a battery? What happens? So again, this is a test where this time the commercial lithium-ion battery cell, this one's in a consumer electronics devices like phones, for example. If a screwdriver gets dropped onto it, it gets very hot, releases a lot of energy, a lot of smoke. So this is not something that's good inside a factory. Battery factories have had problems. There was one reported in Korea a little while ago where basically the whole factory caught on fire. This is a too common occurrence in battery manufacturing. But you can see in contrast our battery that was on the left there, screwdriver punctures it, nothing happens. So, promising safety. I'll tell you a little bit about how we accomplish this in a second, but I wanted to get you interested. Why should we care first? So here's the safety is one aspect. The other two aspects about why we should care are shown on this chart. The y-axis shows the charging time of a vehicle from 10 to 80%. That's kind of an industry standard marker. When you're charging up the vehicle, you want to go fast in that range, get a lot of range back on your car. So that's the y-axis, and the x-axis is the cell energy density, volumetric energy density, watt hours per liter. This is a metric of how long range the car can be, because if the battery has higher energy density, then you can fit more batteries, more energy into that same car. So lithium-ion batteries occupy a frontier. This is called a Ragone chart between power and energy, which is common in energy storage devices. There's a frontier where you can trade off more energy or more power, but there's kind of a Pareto optimal frontier that you can sit on. So Porsche occupies this kind of faster charge, but lower energy density corner. A Rivian opted for longer range, but slower charge time, and Teslas of various kinds are kind of in between. Our batteries are able to push out this frontier so you can get both faster charging and higher energy density at the same time. In our batteries, there's still a trade-off between power and energy for fundamental reasons I can discuss in the Q&A if you want, but we can push out the frontier to get both higher range and faster charge times. I've called out one point in particular here called QSE5. This is a QS for QuantumScape, E for energy cell, and 5 for a 5 amp hour cell. This is what it is. A 5 amp hour cell is what's equivalent to a 2170 battery that's in some EVs today, mostly Teslas. So this battery would have the same energy as what is in those Teslas. Not just one, many of them. A Tesla would have maybe 5,000 of these or so. You would have about 5,000 of our batteries as well. But with that many batteries, you can get very long range, and then you can also get faster charging. One trend in the industry is to go up to larger batteries, basically reduced part count, but each battery would be larger. So if we do that, we can get to even higher energy density, which would translate to longer range. That would be a future product. We think that this is going to be our first product. So 3 of our calling cards here, safety, energy density, and charge time, would address a lot of the reasons that consumers today don't buy electric cars. So if you look at various geographies around the world and ask consumers why they don't drive an EV today, among those who don't, they will cite things like the range, the charge time, the safety, which I've already showed you how we address those. Upfront costs, I can talk more about that. What's our cost strategy? And that gets about 80% of the reasons why customers don't drive electric cars today. So that's the technology we set out to try and invent, was a technology that could kind of open up the whole vehicle market to electric vehicles. I think in the 15 years since we started the company, part of the thesis has been proven out, which is that electric vehicles can be attractive to consumers. You can make high-performance EVs, but to open up past the early adopters and get into really the mass market adoption, we think that batteries like ours are still necessary to address these points. So hopefully I've got your attention. Now, how do we make this battery, and how is it different from a lithium-ion battery? On the left is a schematic of what you'll see if you open up a lithium-ion battery. The main functional layers are an anode, a cathode, and a separator that separates them. The anode is this layer up on top that stores lithium when the battery is charged. Then when you discharge the battery, lithium moves down into the cathode layer. The separator prevents an internal short circuit between the anode and cathode. So it's basically a physical medium that keeps the layers apart from each other. And then in a lithium-ion battery, the entire battery is bathed in, or basically swims in, is immersed in a liquid electrolyte. This electrolyte is what transports the lithium back and forth between anode and cathode. The separator in a lithium-ion battery is porous. Think of it like a saran wrap that holes are poked through. So the pores allow the lithium and the electrolyte to move through, and the plastic just keeps the layers apart. Our battery, we've tried to make higher energy density, as I've said, and the way we've done that is, I think, the single biggest step you could take in improving the energy density of a battery is to eliminate the anode. All of that graphite is there to hold lithium and keep the battery safe, but it's not productive in terms of contributing energy to the cell. So delete. If there's a part you don't need, delete it. That should lead to lower costs, better process control. It also leads, in this case, to a lot of the other properties that I've discussed. That sounds simple. It's not simple to do because a lithium metal anode is not compatible with these porous polymer separators. What happens is, as you charge the battery, lithium will grow through the pores of the separator and create an internal short circuit. So there have been people who've tried for decades to solve this. It's a very difficult challenge. The approach we've taken is to replace the porous polymer separator with a fully dense ceramic material. And that in many ways is the core innovation of our technology. The ceramic is a solid state electrolyte. It allows lithium to pass, but it's made in a way to try and prevent dendrites. It's also made to try and prevent the other main degradation mode of lithium metal in the liquid system, which is what's called low coulombic efficiency. So lithium metal is one of the most reactive materials you'll ever encounter, and it reacts with virtually every liquid electrolyte. So this reaction consumes both the electrolyte and lithium in ways that degrade the battery's performance. So we've, again, replaced this liquid electrolyte and the porous polymer separator with a solid that's then compatible with lithium metal. So by doing that, we've hoped to solve these two main challenges. We didn't invent the concept of a solid-state electrolyte either. Many other groups have been pursuing that for decades. I think our unique contribution is understanding what materials are the best materials to use, but even more importantly, how to process them in a way that will prevent dendrites, that is compatible with lithium metal, that's also compatible with making this material at high quality and at low cost. That's taken about 15 years to get to this point, so it's definitely not a trivial challenge. This separator has to fulfill 4 key requirements. It has to be stable to lithium metal, as I just mentioned, to enable long life of the battery, also high power across the full temperature operating range. It has to have low resistance to lithium. That means both the conductivity through the bulk of the material as well as at the interface with lithium metal. This may be counterintuitive, but that couple nanometer interface with lithium metal can present more resistance to lithium transport than the entire bulk of the separator. So we have to be able to make it in a way that has a low interfacial resistance as well as a good bulk conductivity. And then finally, and most importantly, it has to resist dendrites, which is a main challenge that I'll talk about in the second half of this talk. So to basically wrap up what this battery is in a nutshell, I think it is, if you look at the complete package of all the metrics that are important, I think as Professor Prins was saying earlier, in many ways the world's best battery. So in terms of energy density, today's lithium-ion batteries are at best mid 200 watt-hours per kilogram. Ours is 300 watt-hours per kilogram. We've demonstrated fast charge in 12 minutes and below. This chart on the top right shows the rate capability of the cell as you discharge at faster and faster rates. A typical automotive cycle would be if you're driving aggressively on the highway, you can fully discharge a battery in about 3 hours. That's called C by 3, C divided by 3 in battery parlance, because it takes 3 hours to discharge a battery. And we're showing up to 10C, meaning 6-minute discharge. So it's kind of ludicrous to take a long-range electric vehicle and try and discharge it in 6 minutes. But if you need extremely high-power pulses to accelerate, you want to drive on the track, you want to do a drag race, this battery is capable. This shows the temperature range from 60 degrees C down to minus 30 degrees C. It will operate across the full temperature range. That's traditionally been a real challenge for solid-state batteries, which often need to be heated to work. So this can work at room temperature and below, all the way down to minus 30. And by the way, in a way that is better than most lithium-ion batteries that you'll find on the market at low temperature as well. This, in fact, shows that comparison of a lithium-ion cell that's popular in electric vehicles today versus ours, showing the energy density versus temperature, where our battery is higher than a lithium-ion battery across temperature. And then finally, this is a summary of many different safety tests where we're achieving good hazard levels. There's a industry standard safety tests and industry standard metrics. How do you evaluate it on a hazard scale? And we're passing on all of these tests that I'm showing here. So that kind of wraps up in a nutshell the capabilities of this battery. So next, I want to switch gears a little bit and go into one much more narrow, more scientific deep dive into how one way that's been really important into enabling us to develop this battery. And so what I'll be talking about is a metric called critical current density. This is a metric of how well a solid-state electrolyte can withstand lithium dendrites forming. So lithium dendrites, as I mentioned, are a key failure mode in lithium metal anodes. And a key empirical finding over several decades is that dendrites form more aggressively at higher current density, meaning higher charge rates. As you pass more lithium per area, the lithium dendrites form more and more aggressively. And it's been a big mystery in the field as to why that is. We think we've understood why that is. I'm not going to talk about that, but I will talk about a way that we measure this metric. It's essentially a stress test. So a simple analogy is imagining you're evaluating the strength of a material and you bend it until it breaks. That's a stress test. How much strain does a material accommodate before fracture? So likewise, we are applying a stress that is the current density to our parts, and we're monitoring at what current density do they fail. That would be then the critical current density. So a test is very simple here. The schematic of the test is just you have your solid state electrolyte or separator material. You have one electrode that lithium plates onto and another lithium reservoir that you can use to supply the current density. You hook that up to a voltage supply that'll drive current across the cell, and you turn up the current until you measure a failure. So pretty conceptually simple stress test. It indicates the capability of the material and also then the factor of safety that your separator would have in a real-world application. We recently did publish a paper on this, so you can look it up. It's in the Journal of Electrochemical Society. And if you're really curious about the details, we published this paper open access because I'm a big believer that science should be open. So anybody can access this paper and take a look at all the details. I'll walk through at kind of a higher level why this test is important, how we perform it, a couple of the more scientific implications that we've drawn from it. So we've designed this. This test is so important for us that we've designed it in a high throughput fashion. It's really important for us to collect a lot of feedback and to collect that feedback quickly. So we do this test quickly, both in series and in parallel, to get more information. To collect more data in series, what we do is we take one separator material and then deposit a lot of different electrodes on it so that we can test as a function of the area. We can get a statistical relevant sampling all in one shot. And then we've also done a lot of optimization to make this test a really fast turnaround test so that in about 16 hours we can collect about 1,000 data points. And we've been doing this over years at the company. So we've really collected a lot of data. So we deposit lithium via evaporation through this evaporation mask, and then we load onto a testing apparatus that has a lot of spring-loaded contacts that can come down and make contact with every electrode simultaneously, so that we can then, with software, sequence through all the devices and, like I said, measure thousands of data points or about 1,000 data points in 16 hours. It also gives us some spatial mapping capability that we can then use for failure analysis and feedback. If we're seeing that one particular area failed early or a region of a material failed earlier than another region, we can then do some further analysis to figure out why. And that's been really important to closing the feedback loop and allowing us to improve further. This shows a little bit about how we've optimized the test recipe for fast feedback. What we want to do is collect data that's valid, that's representative of the part, but that's quick to gather. So we've done some optimization of the test protocol itself. We just imagine the bending test. A question is maybe how fast do you apply the stress, or how long would you wait while applying the stress until you see if there's a fracture in the material. So in that analogy, we do the same thing with current. We apply current for a certain amount of time, monitor to see if the material fails. If not, then we increase the current. So this shows a little bit about how we've chosen those current density increments, how much current density we pass at each step before we increase. And so this is the simple math to get to almost 1,000 data points in 16 hours. We then analyze this data statistically. This is one of my great passions. I unfortunately went through my whole Stanford education not learning very much statistics, and then I had to teach myself after the fact because I sat in a lot of meetings where we would question our own results, or we would say, I have to repeat that test. And I thought, well, why? We've already done the test. Why do we have to repeat it? So I kind of came to understand that, well, statistics is the set of tools to allow us to quantify uncertainty and say, how certain or uncertain are we about this result? How should we design our experiment to be a better experiment that gives us more valid data? And after we've gathered the data, how do we analyze it? Or how much confidence do we have? So we use survival analysis. This is a field of statistics that's common in medicine. If you're looking at like a drug, for example, you evaluate your treatment versus a placebo, and you evaluate the survival of patients. So we haven't invented this technique. It's a very standard technique in engineering reliability analysis and medicine, but we apply reliability analysis I think, for basically the first real time in this field of solid-state electrolytes. So a key graph that we often look at is this survival graph, where it shows the survival probability versus the stress factor. So at low stress on the left, you have the entire population surviving. As you increase the stress you apply, you'll see the population starting to fail. And then you can generate confidence intervals. This dark line is the data, and the confidence intervals are the shaded interval around that. So we can then say with a certain degree of confidence how many of cells survive a given current density. This is the point estimate here, and then these are the confidence intervals. So what you're seeing here is 99% of the probed material surviving at 100 milliamps per square centimeter. Let me put that number in context for you. A battery doing fast charge that I showed earlier would be passing 20 or 25 milliamps per square centimeter. So about a quarter of that level. What's reported in literature, if you look at other people performing similar tests, is they'll report typically one data point of around 1 milliamp per square centimeter. The highest that I've seen reported is 13. I have some questions about whether that's a real result, but putting that to the side, the range of like 1 to 10 is typically the best in the world that you'll find published. And what we're showing here in this result was 99% survival to 130, about a third surviving to 300 milliamps per square centimeter. So the main takeaway, though, survival analysis is the main technique that we use for quantifying our results. I'll do one quick digression here into ensuring that we've tested the validity of our test. One question that we've gotten sometimes is, are you applying this current density for a long enough time to cause a failure, if there is going to be a failure, or are we just doing the test too quickly? Imagine you bend a material very quickly, it'll break at some point. Will that break happen at the earlier or later point than if you bend the material slowly? So that's what we wanted to validate for ourselves, to make sure we're performing a valid test. If we applied current for a longer or shorter time, would this failure population differ? Short answer is we picked a value that we're confident is valid. And the way that we assure ourselves that it is valid is we look at this failure fraction over time as we're applying current density. And we pick a time in which most of the failures occur, if they're going to occur at that current density. So we're showing 3 different durations of the test, and showing that even in a long test, almost all of the failures happen early. So we can be confident that we are recording a failure if the device is going to fail at that given value of stress. We then look at that data statistically by overlaying the survival curves. And as you can see visually, they overlay quite well. When we do the quantitative analysis in the table on the right, what you would see quantitatively and statistically is that there are not significant differences between these populations. The way we quantify this is a technique called restricted mean survival time that I'd be happy to get into if there are questions, but it is a technique in survival analysis. One other caveat here is we have tuned this test to be valid for our material. There's no guarantee that it would be valid for a generic or randomly chosen solid-state electrolyte. So if you're studying a solid-state electrolyte in your lab, you should perform a validation like this. It's not guaranteed that you can just take our test and use the same parameters. But we have shown you basically a recipe that you could use to validate your test. Next, I'm going to talk about 2 other features of this survival analysis. The first is that the survival you could find empirically depends on the area of the device that you're measuring. And the second, you'll find that survival depends empirically on the temperature that you're running the test at. There are good reasons for both of those, and we can discuss why that is and the effects of why that is. So first of all, another statistical analysis technique that's common in the field of reliability studies is what's called a Weibull distribution. So the Gaussian or normal distribution is used for many statistical tests. Failures tend not to be distributed normally, but they tend to be distributed by a Weibull distribution. This is because failures happen with kind of a weakest link phenomena. And so this Weibull distribution is developed to study phenomena like that. So when you fit your failure population to a Weibull distribution, you can then extract a lot of interesting features from it. So it allows us to then scale our survival data with area and with temperature, as I just mentioned. It turns out if you measure and extract the survival curves, fit them to Weibull distributions over different electrode areas and different temperatures, there are good scaling laws that come out of that. So first of all, the temperature scaling happens to be an Arrhenius scaling factor. This is because of the mechanical properties of lithium. Lithium melts at 180 degrees C, so even at room temperature, it's above its homologous melting point. So its mechanical properties, its flow, its creep, are depending on temperature. So that is why there's an Arrhenius behavior with temperature. But this scaling law allows you to then understand how your solid-state electrolyte would behave across temperature. And second, there's an area scaling that's basically a power law with the area of the device you measure, because again, failures will happen at a weakest link or a biggest flaw in a material. So the larger area you probe, the more likely your probe is to encounter a flaw. So there's just an area scaling relationship that then allows, once you measure a statistically valid data set at any area, you can extrapolate then to any other area. So these features have been useful in driving our analysis and driving our performance of our material. We have, like I said, used this test in a high throughput fashion. To quantify that, the graph on the left shows over the last couple of years how many tests we've run, over 400,000 valid data points here. We're running at a pace of over 100,000 per year. That pace is accelerating as we have learned more about the test and have learned how useful it is. We're also scaling up our own test capacity. So it's a very important test. And then the graph on the right shows how we've used the test to drive improvements in performance over time. So again, this is a survival curve where the x-axis is the current density. And to ground you, the best published results are between 1 and 10, and a battery would have to perform at about 20. In earlier generations, we saw a lot of the population fall off by about 50 milliamps per square centimeter, giving us about a factor of 2 of safety. But as we've used this test to improve our performance over time, in later generations, we've driven out to really unprecedented levels. I think our publication is the first to get anywhere close to these levels of performance. So this curve on the right is not the latest and greatest, but a relatively recent population where you can see over 90% survival at 300 milliamps per square centimeter. So a pretty impressive result. This is what we use then to gain confidence that our batteries should work in the field. They've got some considerable factor of safety. So I'm right here at the end and right at about time. Just to summarize our test, we showed some ways to validate that our test gives us valid data, that our pulse length, the style of test we run where we're passing current in one direction is a valid test, and we're using it to probe the critical current density, which is a key performance indicator of a solid-state electrolyte, that there's an area and temperature scaling that are well behaved and have good underlying physical reasons for them, that we are showing the field that using survival analysis and Weibull analysis instead of single point values that are commonly reported helps researchers to gain statistically significant results, and that our separator has shown entitlement to pretty unprecedented levels. So it's taken about 15 years to get here. We did spin off from Stanford, so we have some proud Stanford roots here. We're located in San Jose, and we still have a considerable number of our employees coming from Stanford. This is the data from LinkedIn, shows 21 people from Stanford. So I'm hoping that talks like this can get more people interested, and we have an internship program. We have a few open positions. Please check our website at careers.quantumscape.com, and I'm hoping that we can jump a couple places and beat Cal. So thanks. I'd be happy to take questions now.
Thank you so much for this very impressive presentation. There's also a bit of a criticism for people like myself as far as statistics is concerned. In fact, Tim is right. We are not doing a good job in statistics, but you will be pleased to hear that in my most recent undergraduate class, I gave 1.5 lectures on random and systematic errors. So we are learning.
Good. Great.
Please, Tim has some time to respond to questions.
Questions. Great.
So you mentioned that is this on? Sure. Okay. So you mentioned that there's like the QS large, as in like making larger cells and then having less of them, and that's probably something that you want to work on in the future. Why is that something that you wouldn't do directly? What are the challenges with that?
Yeah, good question. So there are trade-offs in cell size. Different automakers have chosen different design points. So Tesla has used smaller cells, about the same size as ours. Other companies have used larger batteries. The trade-offs are primarily around safety, yield, reliability, cost, energy density. I just said a lot of things real fast, so let me break that down. Yield and reliability, it's kind of the point that I was making earlier, where if you have any defect that scales as a function of area, the larger cell you make, the more likely you are to contain a defect. So larger cells have worse yield and worse reliability. They also have worse safety because a larger cell has more energy in it. So if the cell is punctured or is in a crash, that'll release more energy, which is then more likely to propagate to the adjacent cells. So that's one key reason why Tesla has chosen to stick with smaller cells, is for safety. But as you make the cell larger, you can get more energy density because it's a surface area to volume scaling ratio, basically. The packaging on the outside of the cell does not contribute energy, but it does contribute mass and volume and cost. So if you make the cell larger, that becomes a smaller fraction of the overall. So different companies have chosen a different trade-off point. And the other point was, why are we choosing to start smaller? We're trying to get a product into the market quickly. And so some of the points like defect scaling are easier if you start small. We think our product is still pretty compelling if it's small, and we're working with some customers who are excited to put that into a car. So that's what we'll start with, and then over time we'll make larger batteries.
More questions? Okay, great.
How do you guys plan to mass manufacture or implement your technology to more products?
Yeah, so we've decided that we will be licensing our technology to companies that want to mass produce. So the public company that's working with us is Volkswagen. There are other partners that aren't public at this stage, but the idea is that we would work with our partners, our licensees, to help them scale up into their factories. So the thought here is we've observed other battery companies that invent new technology then struggle to scale because it takes a lot of money and a lot of manufacturing expertise from a startup company that is often designed around science or R&D. It's kind of a different DNA and a whole different level of scale and skill set required. So that's basically why we're choosing to partner with companies, so that they can bring their manufacturing expertise, their large balance sheets to play. So Volkswagen in particular has 3 gigafactories that they're making in Germany, Spain, and Canada. And so we're working with them to put our technologies into their factories and try and commercialize it as quickly as possible.
Thank you. I'm just curious, how tunable is your ceramic layer for, saying I want to be on a different part of the trade-off graph here?
Of size, you mean?
Density, any kind of property that can
Okay.
tunable.
Yeah. So there's like extrinsic properties and intrinsic properties. So intrinsic properties like its density, that's a materials property. Say its strength is largely a materials property, somewhat modulated by processing. But the materials properties can't change. We think we've picked essentially the best material and the only material that we think works. But then other features like how large you make it, that's just a design parameter that we can pick.
Other questions? Great. Okay. I'm going to move up to the front.
Thank you, Tim, for an incredible presentation. I'm curious about you presented one of the first few slides on the nail penetration and safety overheating safety data. I'm curious about whether that was done in the fully charged state, and how you sort of deal with the safety with the solid lithium metal in a fully charged state.
Yeah.
With the solid state battery.
Yeah. So our tests are done in the fully charged state because that's the most energetic, most dangerous state. So you want to test the worst case. So in our battery, that means there's a chunk of lithium metal sitting on every anode. So it's a great question about then, that sounds dangerous. How does it work? So our solid state separator, I think here again is the key to safety. The single biggest improvement to safety that lithium ion batteries have made over the last decade or two has been to add a little bit of ceramic onto their separator. So this porous polymer separator now in many applications has a coating on one or both sides of a very thin porous ceramic, like an alumina powder. And what happens is, as a lithium ion battery fails and gets hot, the polymer melts. And if you don't have any ceramic at the interface, then anode and cathode touch and you get a rapid thermal runaway. By sprinkling a little bit of aluminum powder on both interfaces, there's basically like a little bit of sand to prevent large-scale contact. In our battery, it's not that we have a little bit of a porous ceramic. We have a fully dense, the whole separator is ceramic. So it really is a good isolation between anode and cathode that keeps the battery more safe, we believe.
Hey, so you talked about getting to these record levels of current density. I'm curious what kind of applications this might enable and maybe what kind of fundamental breakthroughs, if you can share, led to these developments.
Yeah, thanks. Good questions. What it might enable basically is even faster charging. This critical current density is a metric of how fast are you charging the battery. So what we're trying to show is that the separator should not be the limiting factor in how fast you charge. It makes the limiting factor either the cathode or the charging infrastructure. So either basically the cathode, you can charge our battery as fast as the cathode in our battery allows you to charge it, or as fast as the charging infrastructure you're plugged into. But we want to have enough factor of safety that the anode and separator are not the limiting factor, whereas in all other published work that we know of, that's the limiting factor. And then you asked, how did we arrive at this? Basically by a pretty deep understanding of what causes failures. So I mentioned that this platform enables us to do a failure analysis to look at why some regions fail. We've developed several different failure analysis platforms and we test virtually every battery we make till failure. Then we take them apart, understand why they fail, generate what's called a Pareto of the most common failure causes. And then those are turn into the priorities for our R&D team, where we say, understand what causes this failure mode, and then how can we avoid it by either the design or the process. And so it's by running that loop a lot over 15 years that we've improved.
Couple more.
So can you say anything about the physics of why the ceramics you're using are so much better in terms of both moving lithium atoms quickly and then suppressing the dendrites that cause failure in ordinary lithium batteries?
Yeah, thanks, Professor Orr. Good question. So I'll highlight 3 things in response to your question. So first, in terms of moving lithium quickly, the conductivity of the material is just a materials property. And our separator actually is not exceptional in that. But that's kind of the easiest property to solve. The next one is compatibility with lithium metal. And we spent the first probably 2 or 3 years of the company trying to understand the kinetics and thermodynamics of reactions with lithium metal. What makes materials more and less stable with lithium metal. And now we were doing back then what I think some others have done and published now. Like if you look at the materials project, there are some reaction calculators. So you can calculate the thermodynamics of reactions of solid systems together, for example, lithium with a separator. So they have now developed that. But what I think is not as common is an understanding of kinetic stability. So a lithium-ion battery is not thermodynamically stable. But the way it works is through kinetic stability and passivation of interfaces. And that's an area that we had to study quite a bit. If a material is not thermodynamically stable, it'll react. And then what leads that reaction to either passivate, as in the case of a lithium-ion battery, or continue, as what happens with a lot of solid-state batteries. And that has to do with the reaction mechanism that's specific to each different electrolyte class. But you have to develop an understanding of what promotes stability, kinetic and thermodynamic stability. And then the third part of your question was how to prevent dendrites. And there, I can't talk a lot about the physics, but I can kind of point back to, we did a lot of failure analysis. We then developed a theory of why dendrites form. And then the implications of that theory were, how do we process the material to avoid the defects that we're sensitive to? So unfortunately, more than that is proprietary.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Could you discuss the positive and negative aspects of having a battery that changes sizes when you charge it and discharge it?
Yeah, that's another good question. Let me try and find the schematic. So this shows the lithium plating. Basically, the battery expands by about 15% from fully charged versus fully discharged. Lithium-ion batteries expand by only a couple percent. So we've had to develop this new form factor that I showed earlier to accommodate that breathing. So there's some invention in this too. This maybe looks simple, but it's designed to accommodate that swelling in a, I would say, like kind of clever way. So what there is there's a frame around the outside. That frame is as tall as the battery is tall when it's fully charged. And then there's an inset here so the battery can shrink when it's discharged. And this is in the discharge state here. That's why I'm holding it. Otherwise it'd be a little exciting. But in the discharge state, you can see there's a recess here between the frame and the active stack. So when the batteries are assembled into a battery pack, the frames touch each other and they're assembled frame to frame. And then the expansion kind of happens within that frame. So the application doesn't know that the battery is expanding and contracting.
You expect to see any failure modes, mechanical failure modes in expanding and contracting?
Yeah.
My question is also in line with a recent article in Science addressing that problem. In solid-state lithium-ion batteries, regardless of charging current magnitudes, whether it's large current charging or low current charging. Can you address that question?
Yeah. So a lot of the fracture that happens in solid-state batteries is because they operate under high pressure. If you look at publications over decades on solid-state batteries and lithium-metal batteries, they've virtually universally state that these batteries have to be placed under high pressure to work. To keep the lithium metal well-behaved and dense, you basically squish it flat. And to keep all the solid-state components in good contact while things are moving and expanding, contracting, you apply high pressure. So if you look in publications, they'll state 10 atmospheres, 100 atmospheres of pressure, like really obscene levels that are not practical in a device. So a lot of our development has been to develop a battery that can work at low pressure. And I didn't talk about that today, but we have published data previously that our battery typically operates around 1 or 2 atmospheres of pressure, is also capable of operating at 0 applied pressure. So if you're at very low pressure, then the concerns about cracking are much alleviated. The second comment I can make is that this frame around the outside is the mechanical protection for the battery inside. So we've developed this frame to be basically rigid enough to allow this to pass the shock and vibration tests that are standard in the automotive industry.
Great. Well, we are at time. So with that, let's give them another round of applause, everyone.